Hello, I'm David Gentilcore. I'm in the Department of Humanities, where I teach early modern history. And I'm the principal investigator of a European Research Council advanced grant called The Water Cultures of Italy, 1500 to 1900.
Hi, I'm Craig Martin. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage at Ca' Foscari. I am a historian of science and medicine of the early modern period, and it's my pleasure to be here with you, David. So I know your project is about water, and Venice historically has a complex relationship with water. I mean, maybe you could help us understand that relationship a little bit.
Yeah, no, it would be a pleasure. Thanks, Greg. If we could have image one, that would be a good way of starting us off. What you see here on the left is basically a typical beautiful Venetian scene, which millions of visitors normally see if it weren't for health emergencies and things like that. And will appreciate the beautiful well in the center of a square or campo. What they may not realize is actually that well isn't the typical well we think of, that digs down into an aquifer in the ground, but is actually a very complicated device for capturing, filtering, and storing rainwater. Up until the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, Venice was completely dependent for all of its freshwater uses on rainwater. And so they had to devise these very elaborate systems that involved the entire community to collect this water, to decide who got to use it and what. And so for me, Venice becomes a very useful point of departure for understanding the cultures of water in early modern Italy. Venice, because everything about water and Venice is right there in your face, if you like. It's so evident, but the kinds of issues that all communities face, not just in Italy, of course, everywhere, about water. Civilization is based on water. We can't survive without it, of course, in a biological way, but also in cultural terms, water underpins everything. So one of the things I wanted to do when looking at water culture was, first of all, is what do I mean by water and culture? Well, there's the technological side, if you like, and we saw that in the first image where you have this elaborate filtration system. There we have it again. As you can see on the right-hand side, the rainwater would go in through the kind of holes in the ground and filter through sand before then depositing right underneath the well head, if you like, allowing access to the cistern. So there's an elaborate technology that we find, of course, in Venice, but everywhere to access water. Some cities have a river they can make use of. Others depend on wells. Others may have aqueducts. Most cities are, in fact, using a whole sort of bringing together, what am I trying to say? Bringing together different kinds of uses in order to ensure a sufficient water, because it's a limited resource. So that's the technological side. But there's this whole cultural side. By what I mean is kind of, we have the material culture of it, the technological side, the aqueducts, so on, the infrastructure. Then we have the belief systems that go along with water, the religion, the sacred, socialization. The well itself becomes a point of aggregation for people, mostly women, it has to be said. It's women's work, it seems to be, throughout the world, to gather water, very labor intensive. We know Even today, millions of girls in Africa having to trudge every day, miles and miles, missing school, just to get access to maybe a liter or two of water, and not often very good water at that. Likewise, in the early modern period, even where you've got the well, these beautiful wells throughout Venice, it becomes a point of focus, a site of conversation, of gossip, of dispute. You have to decide who gets the water and when. Jean-Jacques Rousseau even said that water sources, especially in areas where water's in short supply, water sources are the source of language and communication, because you have to decide who's going to get the water and so on. And so that's the other side that I wanted to look at in the project, is to relate the technological aspects, the infrastructural aspects of water, to the whole range of cultural beliefs and practices, occupations even, that revolve around water.
There's been a lot of work about Venice in the early modern period, which talks about locales for exchanging ideas. So there's works about pharmacies as places where ideas were exchanged, or even hat shops. How does the well differ from these other locales in terms of its social function?
Well, it doesn't differ in the sense that it is a site where communication, altercation, confrontation takes place. What may alter is the kind of person who is going to the well. The images we often have are of poorer women, laboring women. Even the depictions of, say, Christ, famous meeting of the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. It's a poor woman he is sort of discussing with. You know? So we have depictions of water sellers gathering water from the well, who will then go on to sell it throughout the city. Invariably, they're depicted as barefoot and in, rags. So there is a definite status dimension to the well as a site of conversation, but we still don't know very much about this.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, you gave a nice biblical reference in there, which also brings back to a point that you made earlier, that these wells and the water were reflected belief systems of early modern Venetians. Can you illustrate how that works with an example?
Well, I'm not. I should stress here that Venice for me is this excellent point of departure. But what I say is not, in some sense, unique to Venice. So even in the technological thing, we have this sense that Venetians, when they walk on solid ground, they are walking above fresh water. Almost every inch of Venice is covering a cistern. I'm not talking, obviously the canals are salt water, but the fresh water is really underneath the feet of Venetians. The same is true in Naples, even though Naples is completely different in the way it gets its water. Likewise, with the cultural systems associated with water, I would say there's more in common than what distinguishes them. For example, we have narratives of people finding images of the Virgin Mary in wells. And these images then go on to perform miracles of healing. And so these are things that, especially from Tridentine reform, when the church is interested in controlling this, we have lots of documentation about people coming across images of the Virgin Mary, miraculous images. Of course, if they're not miraculous, they're not really very interested. They're interested in the miracles of healing. Invariably, these images are found either in wells or in springs, along riverbanks. How they got there, I have no idea, but this association with water. And then to add to this, you have some of these images which are associated with the power to bring rain. And so, of course, in a Mediterranean society, which is characterized by water scarcity for much of the year, and then for the rest of the year, there's too much water sometimes, images like this help to give some sense to people that they can regulate nature, the environment. So there's a very sort of kind intimate interplay with the natural world, which is, of course, what water is. The study of water cultures is really about how human beings can access this natural resource, in a way that's useful for them.
It's interesting. You bring up the idea that, well, I mean, this is a resource which is at times scarce, and so as a result, it needs to be regulated. Of course, the Venetian government during this time period had elaborate systems for regulating all sorts of things. How did they do that with these wells in particular?
One of the, I guess, the main organs of the state that does that in Venice, but I should say that all early modern Italian states have something comparable, would be the Magistrato alle Acque, which is founded in 1501, which is great for an early modernist because we kicked off 1500. So it's perfect timing. Thank you very much, Venetians. But there are many other authorities. This is too is typical of the Ancien Regime, is to have different organs kind of overlapping in jurisdiction. So, of course, the health authorities, the Magistrati alla Sanità, are also very much concerned with the quality of the water that's in these cisterns. So this is more in terms of the regulation of public health.
Well, I mean, that brings up a topic that I've been working on, which relates to the way that medicine and public health was practiced in the 1570s in Venice. Maybe if you could show image 2. So this is the frontispiece for a work on plague, and it was written. It's based on lectures that were given at the University of Padua in January of 1577. And during this time, last couple of months, I've been working on this treatise, making a translation of it, and trying to explain the relationship between learned physicians, medicine as it was taught in the university, and also the regulation and of health in Venice during this time period. Now, the date is important because it was written just months after a great plague struck Venice and Padua and other places in northern Italy, and the estimates are something along the line of 50,000 Venetians died in this plague, and 10,000 people in Padua died. So it's a significant portion of the population, and it had effects on the social fabric of Venice as well. But this particular physician is interesting because he used his expertise that was based on understanding, in large part, Hippocrates, the writings that were attributed to the ancient Greek physician, and he used these to make an argument. In 1575, he was invited by the Venetian public health office, so it was related to these same figures who were looking after the water, and he was invited to diagnose a disease that was spreading in Venice. And the public health office at this point had established a quarantine for part of Venice, and they had diagnosed it as being plague, so something that was extremely serious. But Mercuriali, using his definitions that he took from Hippocrates, said, well, this couldn't be a real plague. because he said that in a real plague, the rate of mortality must be higher than it actually was, because at this point it was just starting, and there were only a handful of deaths each month. And so he convinced the Venetian Senate to disregard and essentially shame the public health office for establishing that quarantine, and removing the white boats that would take people who were ill to the pest houses on the lazzaretti of Venice. And so he uses basically expertise to try and convince the Venetian authorities to take another approach to the disease, and it all ended poorly, as you probably already figured out. And within months of doing this, the disease started to spread. Mercuriali, the name of this physician, at that point gained permission to leave Venice and to go back to Padua and resume his academic responsibilities rather than his practical duties as a physician.
So there's kind of a tense relationship between Mercuriale as a physician giving expertise to a body of public officials who aren't medics, right? They're lay people, and yet they're asking for this medical advice. But do they take it or not?
Well, the public health office remains. They persistently say no, Mercuriale is wrong. It is plague, and they base it on sound medical diagnosis. They say, oh, there are these buboes that have formed, and that's a telltale sign of plague. But Mercuriale uses his expertise and also his power. He had been a physician before this to Alessandro Farnese in Rome, and also to the Holy Roman Emperor. And so he had this fame and this power that he was able to convince the senators to basically overrule the public health office, so that there was, I suppose, a social dynamic there as well. He's this authority. He's somebody who's used to dealing with power. The public health office is perhaps a more modest group of figures who are unable to persuade the politicians. So one of the things that this also shows you, I'm sure that if you haven't found them yet, you'll find them with your examples of the well, is that the officials have to deal with the various social groups and their regulation of water, or in this case, the regulation of disease.
Well, it's true. There is always a fear of the wells being tainted and somehow being used to transmit disease. I mean, the same we have with the first descriptions of syphilis in Naples. The French call it the mal de Naples, blaming the Neapolitans, poisoning their wells so that the French soldiers would be taken ill with this new disease. And I wondered, in your reading of Mercuriale, but especially in your dealings sort of on the public health side of it, whether the sort of contrast or the tension between medical advice, medical knowledge, medical expertise, and then the practical side of having to deal with this disease, whether that conjures up echoes with COVID-19 and the way states have dealt with it, have used or not medical advice.
Well, I mean, I suppose there's lots of analogies, and a lot of the questions are the same. Will the plague come back? Will it grow? What are the best ways to treat it? And there's disputes because there's so much that is unknown about the course of the disease, and we certainly have experienced that in the past in the past months. That experts aren't sure, and in fact, some of Mercuriale's fellow professors at Padua disagreed with him. So one of his colleagues, someone named Bernardino Paterno, said it is the start of plague.
It is fascinating. I have to see how there can be, in the early modern period, there can be gradations of plague. For us, it's either a disease entity or it isn't. It has clear boundaries. Whereas for early modern Europeans, there's kind of a spectrum.
Well, I think you're right. One of the things that Mercuriale is that he had a sort of a slightly different definition of plague than the health authorities had and some of his other physicians had, that he associated plague with essentially a very dangerous a pandemic. So something that would kill people rapidly rather than a specific disease which has certain symptoms. So any disease which kills people rapidly, he would say is a plague. And this was based on his readings of Hippocrates. So so that's different than the way that some of the public health office looked at it, where they said a plague is a disease that has these symptoms, has these characteristics, and so that there can be a sort of a form of plague that doesn't spread. Now, the other I think the lesson that we might take from this is that decisions about quarantining, about reacting to diseases, are never just something that is scientific. That they are political decisions, and I think that's probably true for any pandemic disease or any sort of public health action. That you just can't say there is a sort of a scientific decision. This is the correct decision, but it's always more complex because you're dealing with different groups of people who have different interests. And Mercuriale, and you can see that in his treatise where he makes recommendations for sort of future governments of how to deal with the plague, and a lot of it has these very strong sort of social elements to it, that the poor should be rounded up because they're carriers of the disease and moved out of the city, is one of the recommendations that he said. And he's also makes lots of recommendations about the environment that would affect certain groups of people. So he says that sort of shops where or smiths are working, where there's fire, should be closed down because that creates heat, which exacerbates the disease. And then one of the reasons that that he thought it wasn't plague at the start is he said, well, that it's just a sort of a disease which is in a few spots. And he said that the cause wasn't from the air, which he thought was the cause of the disease, but rather it was because poor people were drinking salty water. So that there had been water that I suppose because of flooding or contamination of the wells had become salty, and this had made them sick. So I mean, this makes me wonder, and I'm sure you could answer this: is how did they consider healthy water? How did they figure out what is healthy water? How did they conceive it? And how did that fit with their ideas in general about?
Because of course, Venice, which he's talking about, has this problem whenever there is high tide and the salt water comes in. Of course, there's a risk that the salt water goes right directly into these cisterns. So there are public officials whose job it is at the first sign of high tide to plug up the holes. You know, everyone is kind of engaged in ensuring the quality of the water in the wells. But if I could have image 4, this is Tommaso Rangone. Or Rangoni, he goes by quite a few names. He's from Ravenna, but lives in Venice for a long time. This is on the facade of the church of San Zulian, which is very close to St. Mark's Square. And he's one of these people who writes about water, who writes about drinking water. Actually, he's very good at understanding his audience. One of his books is called How to Live to Be 120. Which is basically a regimen or a health guide, what foods to eat, what things to drink to stay healthy, basically stay off fruit and vegetables is his advice. There's always a section in these books on water. And there's a quite elaborate ranking of which waters are best for one's health. It's not necessarily water purity in our understanding. Rather, it goes back to the ancient world. If you think Pliny's Natural History or Hippocrates, we've already talked about Hippocrates, his airs, waters, and places. Each water is different. I mean, for us, it's basically H2O, and then we do chemical analyses to decide how pure it is. For early modern Europeans, and then for the whole classical world, each water, every manifestation of water, every lake, every stream, every river, every well, every cistern is different. And so the job for doctors, at least in this regimen literature, these health guides that they publish, and it's a very popular genre, as you can guess, who wouldn't want to live to 120? Are full of advice about how to determine which water to drink, but also how to rectify problems. So each author, and I should say Rangone, also writes a book specifically targeted at Venetians. Basically, he says, Venetians, this is how you can stay healthy. So he's got a good market. Every Venetian's going to want to read this book. But doctors in every city in Europe are writing similar books. So their advice is to drink the local water. We think eat local, that's something new, that's something we invented. No, it's an ancient concept because what is local becomes the fabric of your body. So because it's your physical makeup, it's always best to eat, to drink what's local. But it's interesting that the advice, for example, the doctors of Rome, they wax lyrical about the waters of the river Tiber. But they say, make sure you store it in earthenware jars for at least 6 months before drinking it. So even there, they realize, okay, the water is okay, but we need to take measures just to ensure that it's okay. It's striking that visitors to Venice, people like Fynes, Morrison, so we're thinking end of the 16th century, that kind of period. They love the waters of Venice, these cistern waters. Likewise, when they go to Naples, it's the same thing. It comes in via an aqueduct, so it's not rainwater, but it sits in these huge stone reservoirs under the city. One of the authors says, it's been sitting here for 100 years. This is the best water I've ever tasted. And so I was trying to figure out, how could people in this period rant and rave about water that's been sitting there for hundreds of years as the best kind of water? So in other words, I needed to read through this medical literature in order to understand that, in order to make sense of what the cistern actually does for early modern Europeans. Rangone says, the water, it as we saw in the first image way back, it goes through the sand, and then it's filtered, it sits there, it purifies. He uses the word purges. This notion of purgare in the early modern period in Italy is about purification. It's also used in a religious sense, in the sense of salvation, purification, purifying oneself of sin. That's what Lent and Advent are all about. So water is going through a similar kind of process. Whereas other medical authors in other cities dispute this notion that cistern water is best. So what you were saying about Mercuriale, there's kind of no perfect agreement amongst doctors. Well, the same is true for what they say about water. What I'm trying to do is relate that to actual experience. Because we have this sense that people in the past didn't drink the water. They thought, oh, this is going to kill me, so I won't drink it. And yet, before the arrival of Asiatic cholera in the 19th century, they had no sense that the water itself might cause me harm. It's more the kind of miasmas that bad water, like marshy water, might give off, rather than drinking this stuff. And so it's about making sense of this, and also how people responded or dealt with their local situation. So that's where environment, climate, geomorphology comes into it. I mean, if you've only got a muddy stream running around your town, which has to power the mills, first of all, which the washerwomen are also using to wash clothes, and what do? So it's about trying to deal with the natural world. I guess that's what water is all about. It's how human beings are dealing with that interaction with with culture and nature, if you like. Yeah.
I'm interested. The recommendations that you mentioned at the start that Rangoni gave for eating, essentially avoiding fruits and vegetables, was also a sort of a classist recommendation, in that vegetable, the food of country folk and the peasants, while patricians had diets that were heavily, if not exclusively, based on meat. Do you see something similar with these recommendations about water?
Definitely, in terms of the fruit and vegetables, it definitely has a social element to it. Although they did give medical explanations. With regard to water, I don't see that as much. It doesn't come through. I mean, the one thing that they will reiterate, this throughout Europe, is that the laborers, urban laborers, the peasants, they have strong stomachs. So they digest just about anything. Whereas we elites, we're refined, we're sophisticated. Well, our stomachs are refined and sophisticated as well. They're delicate. So we have to treat them. We have to be a bit more careful.
This idea about purification and purging, where it also has a religious element. I suppose it also brings us to some of these ideas about sort of pollution. And so pollution in, say, the pre-modern world has a strongly moral connotation to it. I mean, we have the tendency to think of it as something that is essentially material, but it has a sort of a much different sense. I mean, even if you think going back to, say, in Homer, the idea of people being polluted, or corpses being polluted. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about this. And going back to this, the importance of religion with water and purging, perhaps finding the right kind of balance as well.
Well, there is, as I was saying, there is this link between sin and purity. The kind of what we have to go through to purge ourselves of sin is kind of akin to what has to be done to water in order to purify it, to these elaborate systems. But I was thinking, if we went back to the Marian literature, these images of the Virgin that people are coming across. Or if we think of the role of the spring as a place of rebirth. So it's religious, it's also medical, and it's difficult to disentangle the two. And probably as historians, we shouldn't even try, because where there is this intermingling, it's about trying to understand the role of religion and medicine in using these kinds of springs. And there's a direct temporal link between the springs and then thermal spas, people starting to go to, of course, they're doing that in the Middle Ages, but in the Renaissance, with the revival of the classical world, you get the revival of thermal springs, the use of thermal springs from a health point of view, a health perspective. So, and then that kind of feeds in a bit later to this cult for mineral water. Well, now Italians are amongst the biggest consumers of mineral waters, bottled mineral waters in the world, despite having perfectly good tap water in most places. It's a kind of a paradox, but what we don't know about is the kind of early modern history of mineral water. We know that doctors like Francesco Redi and his medical consultations of the middle of the 17th century was advising specific mineral waters for specific conditions. You know, sort of a glass of this every day before you take any food, sort of thing.
Well, when you mentioned this relationship between the understanding of the divine and understanding of water, that also ties into something that I've been working with Mercuriale. So in his treatise, one of the things he says repeatedly is that the cause of plague is divine at times, and also its removal. And he understood that as also relating to specific understandings of the causes of plague. So this is a famous bird's eye view of Venice, that a series of woodcuts that fit together, and you can see Venice in great detail. But what I want to point out is you might notice that this is just one little segment of it, but on all the directions there are the winds that are blowing into Venice. And just as water had a important role in the understanding of the preservation of health during this time period, so did the air. And Mercuriale thought that the air could be altered in multiple ways. And one of the ways was these winds. And so in particular, he blamed the southerly wind of Auster, which more or less is the same Scirocco, which Venetians today are familiar with because it brings the high tides typically in the fall. But for the early moderns, this wind was dangerous for another reason, and because of the qualities that it brought, particularly that it was hot and wet, and this would lead, they thought, to a corruption of the air and a putrefaction of the air. They thought that air in its purest form couldn't rot, but if it was mixed with other kinds of substances, it could putrefy in a way that would bring disease. So this is one way that he understood the air as being something that would bring disease. The other way was what he referred to as celestial forms. So what he meant by that is that there were these occult qualities that came from the heavens, that came from the stars and the planets, which would alter the air itself. And for, for the reason that air was so important, I mean, might be, something that later physicians saw with the water. We see the water, everybody drinks the water, so it's something that's common to everyone. Well,
Mhm.
in the view of many of these 16th century physicians, it was the air that is the most common element. So something that's causing an epidemic or a pandemic, it
Yeah.
must be caused by something that is shared by everyone, namely the air.
But, Craig, what can you do about it? I mean, if you're an I mean, according not to you, but to Mercuriale, if you're in Venice or any of the places he's describing, presumably it applies to Padua as well, where he's teaching. But what can you do?
Well, so there's a number of responses. So one has to do with, so one is a sort of a simple thing about what you can do individually, and that is by not exercising, not working. So you can
Okay, no
you
problem.
so one of the things that Mercuriali says is that the quarantines don't work because they stop contagion, but people who are in quarantine don't breathe as much because they don't go out, they don't work, and so that makes them less prone to getting the disease. So simply being lazy is a potential cure. Now the other cures have to do with altering the air, and he offers a number of remedies, some which are on a small scale and other ones which are on a larger scale. So individually, he says that, well, you can change the air around you. So he recommends various kinds of essentially incenses. So burning sandalwood and other kinds of herbs in your bedroom, or taking terebinth, a product that comes from the same plant that makes turpentine. So this very sort of smelly substance,
Yeah,
and putting it on your garden walls, and this will essentially combat the poison that is in the air. He also
yeah.
recommends wearing gloves, not because we have to do today, but because if you put the gloves on and put perfume on them, they will change the air that's around you. In the same way that if you put perfume under your nose, it will actually change the quality of the air.
Well, that's interesting because we might have this image of the plague doctor,
Mm,
covered in from head to toe, with that cape and the hat and even the goggles around their eyes. And then, of course, the long beak nose. And I always thought of that as offering physical protection against contagion, but I can
mm.
see it's also about creating a barrier in terms of what's in the air.
Yeah, that's true. So Mercuriali, like others, think that there are multiple vectors for contagion. So sometimes it's similar to perhaps what we think. So a virus can be spread through the air, but it can also be spread through being left on surfaces or things like that. And so Mercuriali had another theory that there was a lesser form of contagion through that was passed through solid objects. He called these fomes or fomites, so these kinds of invisible seeds. But he didn't think they were very strong, and he only mentions the clothing of the doctor to say that it's actually something that's potentially hazardous, that it wasn't something that was protective, and that the long tunics that they wore were something could actually sort of pick up the seeds of contagion and bring them home.
So doing
Um,
harm than good, actually.
but he doesn't mention the masks at all, which is a little bit curious. But he does refer to these
It may
cloths.
be early. I mean, some of the images that I think of for the plague doctor that come from the 1630 epidemic. So I
Mm,
actually know when they first started wearing that uniform as a protective device.
mm.
No, I was just curious, since you're translating Mercuriale, you mentioned that from, and it's from Latin. What
Mhm.
if there's some particular difficulties you've had with the Latin? I mean, particular terms, are they difficult to render into English, or does English, maybe from the same period, have the same kind of words that you need?
Yeah, well, some of them are. I mean, in doing these translations, I'm very careful. I try to be careful not to introduce modern terminology, and sometimes that's a little bit difficult. I mean, so one of the words that he talks about all the time is a poison. He thinks that plague works as a poison that will affect your heart and cause your heart
Yeah.
to essentially not be able to protect itself. But the word for poison, one of the words is spelled the same way as the word virus is, and but it's clearly has a sort of a different meaning
Yeah.
than our virus. And I suppose the other set of difficult terms, one has to do with what he calls the Constitution. So by this, what he means is he takes it. It's a translation from Hippocrates that he is using, and for this, he wants to say there's a constitution of air, um, and I mean, I suppose this, we might sort of think of this as a sort of an idea that relates to a later term of the environment, because he
Mm.
understands these epidemics as coming from a particular environment. But the word that he uses is constitution, which actually reflects the sort of the quality of the air, which wind is blowing in. Does it have is it unusual for its season? Is it too hot? Is it too hot for winter? Too cold for summer? Or are there's lots of storms? Or
Craig,
even
Craig, do we get any sense of, I mean, we've heard this with COVID-19, but I'm always interested in modern day parallels. I mean, historians maybe shouldn't be, but I am. It's Is there a sense that you can interfere with the environment?
mm. Yeah, so he makes sort of recommendations on, and some of these are old. He gets them from Al-Razi, a physician who wrote in Arabic in the Middle Ages. Was
Yeah.
one of the things he says is that you should close your windows. The whole city should basically close the windows on the south and open them on the north. He also says that you should stop. You should get rid of any source of miasmas. This relates to the water. So clear up marshy areas. Be very careful about the burial of
Mm.
particularly the dead of the disease, so that the fumes that arise from their body are not spread. And even placing the burial grounds in a place where the wind won't bring those fumes back into the city.
Is there a sense that you can tamper with the environment? Like, one of the things about COVID-19 has been, well, we've interfered too much in the natural world, and that's why we're getting these crossovers, these species jumps.
Mm.
And we always blame the bats, poor things. It's always the bats' fault, but never mind. And I just wondered, is there a sense in the early modern period that you should leave nature alone?
Yeah, I think the sense is maybe a slightly different. I think one that they were sort of less optimistic about the possibility of changing that, and I believe that changes really in the 17th century, in part because of European colonial aspirations. So when Europeans began to travel to South America or Central America or to Asia, one of the things is that they're confronted by is the desire to change the environment so that it fits with their goals, whether they are agricultural or whether they're related to sort of replicating the climate of Andalusia. And they were also confronted by new diseases in these locales, and I think that kind of mentality also changed the way that they began to think in Europe in the 17th century. So there are projects in Rome to change the winds in Rome by this Giambattista Doni, and then there's other projects in Europe where they're changing the environment in terms of, say, in England, draining the fens, and Venice. I think they were aware of it to some degree. I mean, there's I'm sure you know of the work of Karl Apun, who talks about how they managed timber resources, because of course timber was so important for not just for building the city, but also for building all of the ships that Venetians used. And so the government took great steps to make sure that they had sort of healthy supplies of timber that would be continually reproducing themselves. I think sometimes with the plague that there was, at least Mercuriale has a more of a fatalistic attitude to it, that it's brought on one level by God. And it's also taken away by God, and so you can protect yourself to some degree. And he even suggests that maybe you could change the shape of the mountains nearby to change the winds. But on the other hand, that there are still these kinds of limitations. But we also might think that's also a great strategy of these Renaissance physicians, that you always tell the patient there's only so much you can do in case there's a negative outcome, and you won't be blamed.
Well, I mean, early modern medicine and early modern philosophy in general is about the art of the possible. I mean, of course, you're dealing with the world you're living in, and medicine can only go so far, but it does give these tools are strategies for people to live by. It gives you a sense that you have some degree of control over your own reality, even if it's during a major plague epidemic.
Sure. No, there's always, and one of the chapters of Mercuriale is about whether we should have hope or not, and he says yes, we should have hope. So he wants to promote the positive.
Very Christian message as well. He could hardly say otherwise. But medicine does at least for the people of the time give them that hope. However facetious they may occasionally be about doctors in the period, it's the only system they have. So.
Well, I'm curious if for somebody who wants to pursue your interest in water, what would you recommend they do to deepen their knowledge of the subject?
Yeah, if we go to image 5, I'll show you the book jacket that since all my books are still back in the UK. At first I thought maybe I should really choose something about Venice. We have some excellent books about water usage in Venice, for example, by Bevilacqua, also by Costantini, Giormani, some excellent studies. But I thought really to be intellectually honest, I needed to choose the book that really got me thinking about water, the history of water in the first place. When I first saw this book, it had just come out in 2003. It's a book of the proceedings of a conference organized by an anthropologist from Calabria called Vito Teti. It's called the Storia dell'Acqua, and it's got contributions from all over the world, really dealing with this interaction between society and culture and the natural world in terms of water. And it covers everything from the kinds of systems, technological systems, infrastructural systems I've been talking about, to religious, symbolic notions to do with water. All of this throughout the world, and from the Middle Ages, as I recall, to about the 19th century. I mean, it's a fascinating. I know some of the studies go into the present day. No, it's a fascinating collection, and it just was one of those light bulb moments for me that I thought, wow, a history of water, under trying to understand a particular society or culture through the prism of water, water uses, what ideas about water. Fantastic. So it's really this book by Vito Teti that got me going on this topic all those years ago. It's fairly available. There's a 2013 edition as well. What about you, Craig? What's your recommendation?
Well, if you could, well, first of all, thank you for that recommendation. I'll have to get a copy as soon as I can. So if you show image number 6, okay. So this is a recent book by an environmental historian named Sam White, A Cold Welcome, and it sort of fits into to the last point that I was making. The book is about the expectations of Europeans when they came, in this case in particular, to North America. One of the first things that they saw was that North America was much colder than they expected. So that the latitude of North America, so New York is roughly the same latitude as Rome, but New York is much colder than Rome. And so the book explores how these Europeans confronted this unexpectedly cold environment that was even colder than it is now because of the little ice age. So it was a period that was slightly colder than even what people experienced in, say, the 19th and 18th century. So what I really like about the book is it combines this intellectual understanding of climate with an environment, with understanding the colonial aspirations of these Europeans, and how it affected the settlements that they built in North America, how they conceived of the world. And in fact, one of the lessons we can take of it is that this sort of the idea of climate as something that is local rather than sort of mathematical really comes out of this time period. That climate is caused not just by latitude, but by a multiplicity of factors, of winds, of rivers, of mountains, and altitude, and all of those things need to be taken into consideration to understand sort of the larger ecology of an area. So I think it's a wonderful work on environmental history, and so I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in the environmental humanities.
Sounds fascinating. I mean, also because both of us have made the reverse journey in a way. I myself have abandoned the rigors of Canadian winters. Although I spent a long time in the UK, but it is fascinating, these notions, these attempts to understand the natural world in the period, and how these aren't a given. You know, we start out, we think as historians, okay, this is how they understood the world. But of course, these are constantly evolving, and they start with all this cultural baggage, but they're then confronted by direct experience, whether that's the experience of water, experience of plague, experience of climate, you know, and this affects the way they view the world. It affects the circulation of knowledge about these complex things.
No, I agree with you that I think with water, with air, all fit into this sort of this larger relationship with society, diseases that affect society, and also the aspirations of a given people.
Mhm.
Well, I've had a wonderful time talking with you, David.
Greg, it'd be nice to do this in person sometime. Over a glass of prosecco, if I'm allowed to say. It would be lovely. Yeah.
I'd like that too.
Thank you.
Well, I'll say goodbye to you and to all of you who are watching.
Yeah, and likewise, goodbye, Craig, and goodbye to everyone. I hope when you see this that the health emergency is under control as best things can be.
I do as well. Goodbye.
Goodbye.